Good afternoon. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all to this event organized by Yale Macmillan Center and the Pontificia Universidad Javeriana. We'll have an interesting discussion on an issue that is currently central in the social and the political debate, the use and abuse of the police force. The United States and Latin America are close examples of intense social protest as a consequence of the police and the military excessive use of force. Different groups in our societies demand structural reforms aimed to effectively eliminate police brutality against civilians. Unfortunately, previous reforms failed to reduce the illegal use of force by law enforcement agents. The legitimacy of police and military institutions is changed. This panel is a great opportunity to know potential routes of action based on experiences in Brazil, Chile, Peru, and the United States, among other countries. I want to thank my friend Angela Zorro, Yale University and University of Chicago. This event would have not been possible without her work and dedication to make it happen. Angela, the floor is now yours. Thank you all for joining us.
Well, thank you for everyone to join us. Thank you especially to our panelists that accepted this invitation in relatively short notice. Everything has been developed so fast in the continent that we thought we need to open space to open a transnational conversation. The idea to have this panel, this bilingual panel, and to make it available was trying to bring a new flow of ideas and to try to put academia to the service of society, which we think is crucial. So we thank these three amazing panelists, Professor Tyler, Professor Dammert, and Professor Gonzalez, for that effort that you have been doing, translating all your academic work into potential reforms that we actually need. So we're really happy to have this conversation, and we hope that we can keep opening spaces, bilingual spaces, where we can have these conversations both in English and Spanish, and keep learning and keep bringing those flows of knowledge. Understand that the flow of knowledge is not only from the north to the south, but also from the south to the north. So that was our idea of opening this into languages. So we're going to start from the north to the south to give like a little order, and also because that also will give us like space to start from this United States broader context, and then just go deep and finish to, Chile, that it's actually giving us a lot to think in the past hours, I will say. So Professor Tyler will start, then it will be followed by Professor Yanilda Gonzalez, and then we'll finish with Professor Dammert. So thank you so much, and please, Professor Tom Tyler.
Well, I would like to thank you first for inviting me to talk with you about this issue, and I especially thank Angela Zorro for reaching out and involving me. The excessive use of force by police and the military is a long-term issue in the United States and in many other countries, including countries in South America. Recent incidents, and we just heard a list of them, the United States, Colombia, Chile, Brazil, Peru, have focused public attention on this issue and led to social protests. So as a result, we're at a pivotal moment in policing, with opportunities to reimagine how police authority is implemented. Because this is an international discussion, I want to emphasize that while a number of societies face the problem of the excessive use of force by the police, they're different in many ways. The United States has over 18,000 police departments. Colombia has 1. In the United States, the police and the military are very separate. In Colombia, they're one organization. In the United States, crime rates are currently low. In many Latin American countries, they're currently high. So we want to be aware of similarities, but also of differences. Right now, in the United States, there is substantial public support for police reform. If we look at the American adult population in the United States in 2020, 69% thought that the George Floyd death, a recent instance in our country, was a symptom of broader problems in policing. 74% favored banning chokeholds. 89% favored a national database on bad officers. There are a series of kinds of reforms that have been suggested that at this moment seem to have some substantial public support. There's support for regulating all kinds of police practices, such as surveillance, stops and searches. One of the things that's clearly important in shaping that public support is the fact that our crime rate is low. So I'm going to show you a slide here that shows that. I guess I am not going to show you a slide that shows that. Okay. If I were to show you that slide, what it would show you is that the crime rate in America has declined every year for the last 30 years and is dramatically lower today than it was in the 1970s. It's about 20 to 25% what it was in 1970, and that is a big factor in public support for police reform. Challenges to consider when changing the police include the fact that societies need the police to help maintain social order and deal with crime. Research demonstrates that without a police force, crime increases, and also that the effective deployment of the police can lower the rate of crime. However, it's equally clear that police sometimes use excessive force, and that leads to unnecessary injuries and death. And minorities and the poor suffer disproportionately when that happens. Each society faces its own types of calls for change. In the United States, we've recently seen calls to defund the police. I think these, while understandable, are unlikely to be very effective, and I want to try to focus on two approaches that are involved in trying to change the police. One is by strengthening legal accountability, and the other is changing police culture. As I mentioned, there's considerable public support in America today, in the United States, for holding individual officers legally accountable when they use excessive force. This is a series of interrelated reforms, changing rules about qualified immunity, which means that the police could be sued for their actions, using national force standards where every department would be evaluated in the same way. These would be enforced by a national training academy, and they'd be supported by the federal government, which would only fund police departments that followed appropriate rules, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then, of course, there are many suggestions for limiting particular policies, such as no-knock warrants, stops and searches, I mentioned, the use of police cameras, interrogation, investigation, et cetera, et cetera. A series of efforts to hold the police more legally accountable. The legal changes that I noted are important, but they do not address the issue of police culture. And it's time to change police departments' cultures so that the police are less likely to engage in excesses in the first place. We need to move beyond the moment and change the system. The police have a warrior culture that needs to change to a service or guardian model. The police now reward rushing into danger. Procedures need to change to emphasize withdrawing and de-escalating wherever appropriate. When we think about the police, what's really crucial to thinking about change is recognizing that at this moment, the police are trained in only one skill set. They compel compliance by using force, and they're equipped with a variety of weapons to aid their efforts. So every interaction with the police becomes an issue of compliance to the power of the state. This style of policing is effective in getting immediate compliance, but it also provokes anger and encourages resistance. There are situations where the police use of force is necessary, but they're very infrequent. Studies show us that almost everything that the police do in their everyday lives involves dealing with a broad range of everyday crime and disorder maintenance. It almost never involves dangerous people. It also almost never involves threatening situations. This is a problem because the police don't have the training to manage other problems. Their current approach makes many of the problems they deal with worse, and they lack the skills to use different approaches in these many situations where de-escalation or rapport building would be a good idea. The police mismatch problem is getting worse. The United States, the police are being asked to deal with more and more problems that have to do with issues besides the traditional policing mission. 911 systems direct all kinds of community problems to the police, and every one of them is addressed by arms officers trained solely or primarily in the deployment of force. Well, what can we do about this? One suggestion is to limit the police. Perhaps we should only send the police out to deal with traditional police response problems like a bank robbery. We should build up alternatives such as mental health workers or social services and establish better means of triage to get the right services to the right people. The problem is resources. In the United States, I mentioned crime has declined to about 20% what it was in 1970. The number of police officers per 1,000 people in America in the United States has not changed at all. So large proportions of local budgets are tied up in funding traditional policing. This raises the question, where will the resources come from if we're going to think about trying to fund municipal services? Another approach, given that the police exist, would be to diversify the police. We can do that by creating or enlarging unarmed police units. We can train special units within the police that deal with social work issues, and we can train all officers in new ways of thinking about policing goals, moving from a warrior to a service model and emphasizing de-escalation. Well, why would the police change? The current warrior style of policing does not build community trust in the police. In fact, we find that the effectiveness of the police in managing crime is not the primary factor that shapes the public's trust in the police. And just to use an example that suggests that, as I mentioned, in 1970, the crime rate was much larger. Now it's about 20% what it was in 1970. If the police were being rewarded for being effective, their trust would be up. The level of trust in the United States in the police is identical to what it was in 1970. It's around 60% of Americans. Well, we need public trust, so we should care if it's low because it's important in shaping three key public behaviors. One is obeying the law. If people believe that the police are legitimate, they trust them, they're less likely to break the law, to commit crimes. If people have an encounter with the police that lowers their trust, their propensity to commit crimes goes up. Cooperating with the police, people who trust report crime and criminals. They act as witnesses, they act as jurors, they co-police their communities. And finally, bringing problems to the system. If people trust the police, they're less likely to engage in private vengeance or retaliation. So we want trust because trust leads to several important kinds of behavior. And I would emphasize that the role of trust is much greater than the influence of effectiveness in policing. So because it's so important, trust can be central to a new model of policing. This idea is articulated in the Obama 21st Century on Policing Task Force, which calls public trust the first pillar of support for policing. That's not a new idea. In 1829, Sir Robert Peel, when he founded the London Police, articulated the Peel principles, one of which was that respect and approval of the public is central to the effectiveness of the police because it builds the willingness to cooperate with the police. An old idea that's coming back now because it's so relevant to the problems that we have at this moment. Well, why does the public trust the police? The central factor shaping public trust in the police is whether people feel that the police act with procedural justice. This means that they exercise their authority in fair ways. This is true both when people have a personal experience with a police officer and when they evaluate the police in their own community. What does it mean to say people want procedural justice? They evaluate it using 4 factors. One is voice, whether the police give them a chance to speak, to state their case before they make decisions. Neutrality, whether people can see that the police are being impartial, neutral, rule following, consistent. Respect, people feel entitled to treatment with courtesy and respect. And trust, people want to believe that the authorities care about their needs and concerns and are trying to do what's best for them and for other people in their community. 4 different ideas that constitute fair treatment from the point of view of the public. Well, how do we know this is important? We know it's important in 2 ways. First, we can ask when people deal with the police, what determines how that impact affects their willingness to defer to police authority? Is it the favorability of the outcome they receive, the fairness of the outcome, or is it their estimation of the fairness of the procedures being used to deal with their situation? Research is very clear in showing that the primary factor people consider is whether they did or did not receive procedural fairness. And this is true for the members of all of the major ethnic groups in the United States, white, African American, and Hispanic. Everybody evaluates the police by procedural justice. Further, you go from your personal experience to a view of the overall trustworthiness of the police. What's the most important factor? It's the degree to which you feel that you received procedural fairness when you dealt with the police. So we know what we should be doing to build trust. We should be teaching the police to interact with the public in ways that the public experiences being fair. Studies show it's possible for the police to create a culture of trust. Changes in police culture and behavior can and do build trust. And particularly central to some of the discussions that we're going to have about the situation in the countries you're from, trust can be created even in countries that have a history of police actions that create distrust. A good example is the United States. The police in the United States have been the agents of oppression in terms of our African American community, and trust in the police in that community is 30% lower than among whites. Still, we find that you can build trust in that community. One way to start is gestures of reconciliation, acknowledgement of harm, apology. They can jumpstart trust building. We've also worked with Ricardo Canales at the School of Management at Yale to design and implement training for police in Mexico City. What we've found is in a random experiment where trained and untrained officers are compared, that officers who receive procedural fairness training change their conception of their job. In a photo analysis where they're asked to take pictures and write notebooks, trained officers say that building trust and confidence in the population is a primary goal. Untrained officers say we can use the public as a tool to help us fight crime. So a change in the evaluation of the relationship between the police and the community. Behavior changes. An interesting and innovative approach that was used in the Mexico City study is what we call secret shopper study. You stage incidents on the street and you let the police come in and intervene. So you see, what do the police do? The officers trained in procedural justice are much more likely to defuse and de-escalate conflict. And in particular, they're less likely to do negative things that undermine trust. This mirrors findings in the United States and England, where we've consistently found that police training lowers police use of force in the community. In particular, the training program in Manchester in the United Kingdom shows that officers change the way they deal with all the public, and in particular, are much more effective in dealing with victims because they're much more empathetic, they acknowledge harm, they show concern, so they build support in the community with victims. Within departments, procedural justice is not only something that should relate to community interactions with the police. There are also internal dynamics of police departments. Field officers deal with supervisors who deal with chiefs. And interestingly, police officer complaints are the same as public complaints. No procedural fairness. Well, why should police leaders care? If officers feel that their organization is procedurally fair, they're more likely to follow department and organizational rules. They have better mental and physical health, and they deal more fairly with people in the community. So in other words, the police can be changed in two ways. They can be changed because they're trained in a different way, and that causes them to think about their jobs differently. And they can just work in an organization that epitomizes and exemplifies fairness, which causes them to adopt strategies of fairness in their police work without having to be told to do so. And obviously, these things can go together. Okay, well, so let me just conclude and say this. We see instances of police brutality all over different societies, far too many. But it's important, as in the United States, for us to keep emphasizing that these are not just a few bad apples. Obviously, we need to hold bad apples to legal accountability, and we have a whole set of legal reforms that I mentioned that are designed to do that. But we need to move further. We need to change the model of policing that's driving the behavior of all police officers in these different societies. The strategies that flow from a reimagining of police authority have a number of benefits. They include, but they're not limited to, lowering the excessive use of force by the police. Although police brutality is the most highly visible problem in policing, a change in police culture has numerous benefits that go far beyond that, both for the community and for the police. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Tyler. I will not delay Professor Gonzalez intervention.
Well, sure. Let me just get set up here, sharing my screen. Okay, can everyone see that?
Yes, we see it perfectly.
Okay, great. Yeah. Well, first, I just want to thank Angela and everyone who, from UChicago to Yale University to La Javeriana, who collaborated to put this event together. It's really a joy to be on the same virtual stage with Tom Tyler, whose work I know very well as Lucia Dammert, whose work I also know very well, but also have the pleasure of knowing her in person. So hopefully I'll get the opportunity to one day meet Tom as well. So my presentation is actually going to take us to Colombia, focusing on trying to understand what I call the reform gap in policing. And so I'll sort of go through some of that, and sort of, even as you can see from the images that I've used, is trying to trace a moment of a historical process of transformation in the Colombian police, and then but also of persistence of many of the same problems of endemic entrenched violence and corruption. So I'll sort of cover a long period of time, and whenever my time runs out, I will just sort of stop and see where we land. So to begin, just to give you an overview of my work on police reform, it focuses on the ways in which police reform is fundamentally a political process. It seeks to understand the political role of the police and its what I call its structural power. My forthcoming book, Authoritarian Police and Democracy, looks precisely at this question. It looks at the persistence of what I call authoritarian police in democracy and the reforms that seek to promote democratic coercion and the ways in which both of these outcomes are produced by ordinary democratic politics. And here, Colombia is no exception. And a key focus of the book, which will be part of what I focused on here, is the structural power of the police to constrain policy agendas. So because police forces control a fundamental function of the state, which they can credibly threaten to withdraw, they can compel politicians to engage in accommodation, so conceding greater autonomy and fewer external intervention in policing. And so it is this structural power that is at the heart of what I want to talk about today, which is the reform gap of policing, which manifests in various ways. And I'll just give you some comparative examples before landing back in Colombia. Right, so one way that the reform gap in policing manifests is the discrepancy between citizen demands, societal and political mobilizations that demand reform, and the reform that is ultimately enacted, right, which is what happened in my former city of residence, Chicago, where we saw widespread mobilization for police reform following the killing of Laquan McDonald at the hands of police. These societal demands focused on robust external oversight and accountability for the Chicago Police Department, right? And this was even done in conjunction with a civil society coalition that worked with the mayor's office to design such civilian oversight. But the reform legislation that ultimately passed looked very different from what these civil society groups had demanded. It essentially maintained the status quo and just changed the name of an existing institution. But that ultimately civil society activists that had fought for these reforms, they denounced that the legislation that passed would do little to address their critiques about the independence of the existing agency, whose name was just changed without changing much in the way of its structure or authorities, and that it would do little to actually hold police accountable for abuses, right? So just as Tom Tyler was talking about, the societal demands that are made often don't end up being enacted or in actual legislation. We also see a discrepancy between the locus of deficiency and the locus of reform. So the type of problem, the type of institutional deficiency or problem that exists, and the reform that is ultimately enacted. And so here the Minneapolis Police Department is another great example, in that they enacted all of the recommended reforms that emerged in the wake of the Ferguson uprisings, right? They brought in body cameras, implicit bias trainings, and initiatives to build trust with communities, but they left structural oversight and accountability measures untouched, enabling the types of extra-legal violence and abuses that resulted in the brutal killing of George Floyd. Now moving south of the border, we also see instances of police forces that make great strides in addressing some aspects of institutional development, but not others. Is another manifestation of the reform gap. So for example, in Sao Paulo state, Brazil, which is one of the cases that I study very closely, but which I won't talk about today, at least beyond this slide, the Sao Paulo police achieved a number of reforms that actually look very similar to the Colombian reforms that I'll talk about shortly. And they achieved, or at least take credit for, considerable reductions in homicides. But at the same time, police killings have been reaching new records, particularly in recent years, right? So a set of, again, these are what I call operational reforms, community policing, new public management. They adopted these types of reforms that did a great deal to improve the police's standing in society and improve the police's performance, but did very little in terms of accountability and oversight, right? Yes, again, as we saw in the cases of Chicago and Minneapolis. And so again, this shows that the reform gap also emerges in the form of reforms that reach some areas of institutional development, but not others. Similarly, in Colombia, which is the case that I'm going to focus on today, and that I think for most folks in the audience is the one that you might find to be the most urgent. We've also seen the adoption of a great deal of reforms, and we've seen a police force that looks quite transformed relative to what it used to be in the if we were to think back to the 1980s and the early 1990s. Right, so here I've just included a short interview excerpt from an interview I did with a major with the Colombian National Police, who was talking about, before 1993, street officers entered the police force with a 5th grade education, while today the police recruits officers and agents that are professionals with university degrees, doctors, psychologists, graduates in business administration, economists, etc. Right, so there's a police force that sees itself and in fact has become very professionalized by this metric, but at the same time, continued to leave unaddressed, in the ways that I'll discuss shortly, additional problems of accountability and external oversight. And as just one example of that, that major that I interviewed ended up being implicated a couple of years later in the so-called Fellowship of the Ring, La Comunidad del Anillo, the very infamous scandal of corruption and prostitution. And of course, not least of all, this current situation, we find the Colombian police is now under fire once again due to acts of extrajudicial violence, as in the case of the lawyer Javier Ordóñez. So we see a police force that on the one hand has professionalized, modernized, and yet has this problem of accountability. And so it's discrepancies like this that lead me to ask why we see this recurring pattern in which the enacted policies, enacted police reforms don't always reflect or very rarely reflect the substantive problems that generated societal pressure for police reform in the first place. And so this reform gap that is so common in policing manifests as this seeming paradox, right, of police forces that dramatically, on the one hand, improve capacity and performance, but they fail to curb these types of abuses that I've been discussing, or at the same time, the discrepancy between reforms that are enacted and the institutional deficiencies that routinely lead to societal demands for reform. And so I argue that the reason for this reform gap that we see over and over again in policing is that police are able to leverage their structural power to strategically substitute reforms that threaten their autonomy for reforms that preserve their autonomy and which police can implement on their own. And so here I'll provide a theoretical overview of my theoretical framework of why and how police undertake these processes of strategic policy substitution, and provide evidence from my research on police reform in Colombia. And so in this particular paper that this talk draws on, I talk about both reactive cases and preemptive cases, but the Colombian case is the only one I'm going to talk about, which is one of a reactive reform, a reactive strategic policy substitution. And so the key to understanding the reform gap and this strategic policy substitution and the role that police autonomy plays in it is understanding that not all reforms are created equal. This is a fact that is well understood by police forces, but ones that politicians seem to routinely ignore, right? So police reforms come in various forms, and they have different institutional objectives, and they entail different levels of threat to police autonomy. So I won't go over everything on this chart, but I just wanted to summarize a few key points. So first, since I focused so much on violence and excessive extrajudicial violence and corruption, Addressing such entrenched problems requires profound structural and external oversight reforms that change internal police structures and shift power from police forces themselves to external civilian entities. But because such reforms cause a high threat to police autonomy, right? So police lose a lot of their independence and ability to take actions on their own without external interference. Well, we end up being more likely to see are marginal reforms like civilian complaint review boards, or operational reforms like body cameras and community policing, right? These reforms may change police practices, but they very rarely entail changes to internal police structures, nor do they typically disrupt power relationships. So in other words, these types of reforms tend to represent low threats to police autonomy. They allow the police to continue handling their own affairs and to implement these policies on their own with little external oversight. And police tend to prefer these types of reforms and typically pose little resistance to them. So what I argue is that while societal mobilization may demand those deeper structural or external oversight reforms, police tend to prefer those marginal and operational reforms, and they'll do everything in their power to preempt or roll back any structural or external oversight reforms. Instead, we'll seek to replace those with their preferred operational and marginal reforms. And again, because these types of reforms are likely to face a lot less police resistance, they're more likely to last over time. But an implication of this framework is that when we do observe police reform, it is likely to represent limited or constrained institutional change. So that essentially this practice of police being able to strategically substitute reform policies, it creates unevenness between the areas of institutional development and the areas of deficiency. So again, as I've said, operational reforms may improve performance and capacity, and marginal reforms may improve public opinion, but it leaves other substantive issues unaddressed, such as extrajudicial violence, which is our concern for today. And at the same time, strategic policy substitution may also constrain institutional change temporally, because if marginal and operational reforms improve police performance and public opinion, they may make it more difficult to enact structural and external oversights reforms later on. And I will illustrate what I mean by looking at the Colombian case. I'm not going to go too much into detail with the existing literature on police reform, but simply to say that it supports a lot of this argument by focusing on the centrality of police autonomy, that this is something that police will fiercely defend. And at the same time, that some of the types of reforms that are more likely to endure are those that preserve police autonomy and that police have been able to enact on their own. But at the same time, this framework is also it kind of tries to thread a middle ground between two other strands of the police reform literature, which in the US case tend to focus on what I call sort of programmatic arguments. So a problem emerges and a type of reform emerges as well to address that specific problem. And I show that that's not quite the case, right? There's a negotiation that happens between police and politicians so that the reform that's ultimately enacted doesn't always look like the problem itself. And at the same time, it also strays a bit from a lot of the police reform literature in Latin America, which looks at it as a highly political process that is sort of doomed to fail and not last for very long at all. Instead, I say it depends on the type of reform. And so I demonstrate this framework in practice by looking to the case of the Colombian National Police. So prior to the reforms that I'm going to talk about, the Colombian National Police faced a number of important institutional deficiencies. It had low institutional capacity. It was ineffective at fighting crime and violence. It engaged in widespread extrajudicial killings and corruption. And as a result, it was distrusted by the vast majority of Colombians, right? By the time we're looking at a reform passed in 1993, only 20% of Colombians said that they trusted the national police. And so here, the Colombian case is what we might think about as I said, reactive policy substitution, because after this ambitious and comprehensive structural reform, occurred, which I'll talk about in a second, the police started to take action right away to substitute that reform and to roll back its most meaningful structural and external oversight measures. And so instead, the police substituted those reforms with a set of operational reforms that I'll talk about shortly. And in fact, those reforms did seem to work to improve the police's modernization, professionalization, and performance, leading the Colombian police from about 2000 to the early 2010s to really be considered a regional leader in Latin America, one of the more high capacity, more trusted police forces. And yet at the same time, we saw the persistence of egregious acts of corruption, violence, and repression. And that is what has kind of blown up to today, that is leading to the large protests that we've been seeing. So I'm briefly going to trace this trajectory and demonstrate how the police engaged in strategic policy substitution to create these conditions. Following a high-profile scandal in which a police officer raped and killed a little girl in a police station, Colombia undertook a highly consultative reform process involving diverse societal sectors. The new reform sought to overhaul all aspects of policing, seeking to demilitarize the police, create new internal and external oversight institutions, install new administrative structures, and create new participatory institutions. But the police reform that was passed in '93 faced resistance by the police almost immediately. The key targets of police resistance were two measures that threatened police autonomy: a structural reform measure that sought to demilitarize the police rank structure, and an external oversight measure creating a commissioner for the national police, which had very strong oversight authority. My interviews with officials during that time indicated that police resistance was very strong against both these measures. For instance, a retired brigadier general, who was a high-ranking police official at the time of the reform, complained about the commissioner, claiming that he, quote, wanted to seem like he was in charge of the police, and that police worked to make sure that the commissioner knew that he did not have any authority over the police. Similarly, an advisor to the Ministry of Defense at the time told me also that the police did indeed block the commissioner until they toppled him. And meanwhile, an advisor to the president on security issues at the time also told me that the police resisted demilitarization efforts, leading officials to maintain the previous militarized rank structure. And at the same time, the Colombian police cultivated a closer relationship to, so while they were exerting this resistance to the reform that had already been passed, they also sought to cultivate a closer relationship to the United States, particularly by its commander, General José Serrano, who came to kind of be, the US's golden child at the time. And in the face of that police resistance to reform and the growing importance of the national police in the relationship between Colombia and the United States, President Samper at the time in the mid-90s chose to accommodate the police by rolling back many key aspects of the reform. And he even gave a speech to an auditorium full of police saying that we should let the police regulate itself. I know I'm coming up on time, so let me just sort of rush quickly through the types of reforms that the Colombian police did end up implementing, even as they fought these more profound structural and external oversight reforms. Right? They didn't simply go back to the status quo. Instead, the 1993 reform was met with a series of operational reforms that the National Police Commander called a cultural transformation plan. So this combined a set of operational reforms that largely focus on new public management, which applies principles and strategies from the private sector to public bureaucracies, right? And so this includes strategic planning, an emphasis on client and the quality of service, performance measures, management and leadership training, and other similar measures. It also included community policing, which seeks to bring police closer to communities, as well as problem-oriented policing, which entailed partnerships with other agencies and the private sector to combat specific crimes. So all of these measures really go deep in changing police operations and on-the-ground procedures, but they don't really change internal police structures or give power to civilian authorities. And so following the adoption of these reforms, the National Police saw a dramatic reduction in the number of homicides. They saw a number of institutional advances, particularly with regard to capacity and performance. So for instance, Colombia saw its homicide rate cut in half between 1995 and 2010. And of course, we know that these things are not exclusively due to police, but police will sure as hell take credit for it. So this helped in sort of brandishing the police's image as a highly capable police force. At the same time, the police also saw an improvement in its public confidence and trust and public trust. So here we see that by the 2010s, more than 60% of Colombians say they now had a favorable opinion of the national police. And this actually made the Colombian police one of the most trusted in Latin America. And this is back from 2011. And as you can see at the top of that list is Chile, which I want to hear what Lucia Dammert has to say about that and sort of the trajectory of the Chilean police in that regard. But it was during this time that the Colombian police became a regional leader and even went on to advise and train other police forces in Latin America. At the same time, my interviews with state officials and civil society experts at the time, more recently, suggest that the national police today commits fewer grave human rights violations relative to the military than was the case in the early 1990s prior to the reform, when the opposite was the case. But even with these advancements, there's real limits to what which are not insignificant by any means, but there's limits to what institutional deficiencies, operational reforms can address. And the Colombian case really underscores this point. So even as they've improved performance and bureaucratic capacity, the Colombian police continues to engage in high-profile extrajudicial killings, considerable repression of peaceful protests, and ongoing racial discrimination in policing. And sort of all of the recent events from the killings in Puerto Tejada to the killings at protests around Javier Ordóñez, and of course the very killing of Javier Ordóñez underscore these points. And of course, we've also seen occasional corruption scandals such as the Fellowship of the Ring and the periodic other scandals involving drug trafficking. But so what's notable about these remaining scandals and human rights violations is that civil society and government officials that I interviewed cited the police's ironclad autonomy as a key driver of these continuing abuses. So I'll share that now. So first, even in the face of these continued abuses, as I said, my interviews with, for example, human rights lawyers showed that it's very difficult today, even more to hold the police accountable in courts, even more difficult than the case of the police, in the case of the military. But it's not only the courts that are unwilling to conduct meaningful oversight of the police. It's also civilian authorities whose very job that is. So I interviewed someone who at the time was a former delegated inspector general for the National Police, so procurador delegado para la Policía Nacional. And he expressed the view that actual robust external oversight, or what he calls sort of questioning the actions of another state entity, would actually end up weakening the police. So we see a persistence of sort of a police autonomy and an unwillingness of civilian institutions to carry out that task. And we see that even in the face of high-profile massive scandals, structural and external oversight reforms of the national police have proven elusive. And so here I include a quote from Juan Carlos Esguerra, a former defense minister, who also was a member of a reform commission that was created in the wake of the Fellowship of the Ring scandal. Right, and he was pretty, I won't read the whole quote, but essentially he was pretty adamant in emphasizing that the recommendation, the chief recommendation of the commission, which was that disciplinary investigations be removed from the police itself and to have meaningful external oversight of the police, he was sort of saying that this is very unlikely to happen. And he says, this would require a political decision, and it is a major political decision. But in this moment, the idea is not to make waves, and this would be a big wave. And so what we can see from this case is that the police improved replaced very substantive, comprehensive external oversight and structural reforms with operational ones, and performed it and reformed and it improved its performance and public support enough that it shielded it from deeper types of reforms to address problems of extrajudicial violence and corruption. And so what we have today is a Colombian National Police that has seen marked declines in public trust, right? Where today we see that a majority of Colombians now hold an unfavorable view of police, a condition that had not been seen through most of the 2000s. But at the same time, we also see strong societal support for police repression. So the ESMAD, the police unit that is most responsible for repression in protests that has been very criticized as a key source of rights violations by the national police, we see that 58% of Colombians, at least in 2019, believed that the ESMAD should continue to be playing this role in public protest. And so we see that the question that kind of remains is whether the current mobilizations following the killings of Javier Ordóñez, whether it's going to fall, which camp, which type of reform, if any, will emerge from this moment. So even as the police has declined in public trust, there's still a robust societal support for the police continuing to play a role that has resulted in some of the key human rights violations. And so the question is, what's going to happen now with mass protests against police violence and demanding reforms, but as usual, demanding robust accountability and civilian oversight of the police. Is that going to happen this time? That's kind of the big question. So I'll stop there, and thanks everyone for this opportunity to share this work with you all.
Thank you so much, Professor Gonzalez. So I want to now give the word to Professor Dammert.
Great. Thank you, Angela, and everyone else who organized this fantastic meeting. It's a pleasure for me to be with Tom Tyler. We cited him a lot in Latin America. And of course with Yanilda. She's a bright start in our, small group of people working on police issues. So I took the opportunity to talk about two different issues. One is legitimacy, because Tom Tyler is here, so we can, further discuss what Latin America understands on legitimacy, and also police reform. And my first question is what legitimacy means in Latin America. And there is a huge confusion on the concept of legitimacy in policy and studies in Latin America. And of course, in the last 4 or 5 years, every single police scandal has been tackled with the 21st century report of the Obama process. And because that report says legitimacy, now everyone is talking about legitimacy of the police. So it's an interesting, how concepts in policing travel. And Yanilda talked about community policing and POP, and COMSTAT and many other concepts. Just be aware that in Latin America, those are very different in practice from what you can see in the US or in Europe. So in fact, in Latin America, there is scant research on policy, and that's due to limited transparency and opportunities to work with the police. So, and that's a huge limitation to work towards, increasing legitimacy or work towards developing a police reform initiative. So of course, legitimacy includes, trust, includes for Latin American police, more than trust. And here we have trust as a general confidence measure, like do you really trust in general the police? And other questions regarding policing practices specifically. And I think the latter are the most important. But also, and most importantly, most police institutions define legitimacy in terms of police outputs, drug seizures, patrols, detainees. I work almost in all countries in Latin America, but Venezuela, and I mostly work with ministers, chief of police institutions, and even some presidents. And they have their, their standards of how many people should be detained by month. That's really weird, but at the end of the day, that's the way they measure police results and police legitimacy. Also, dropping crime, even though we don't know if the drop of crime rates is related to police changes, and that happened in Central America, and that happens also, as Yanilda explained, in Colombia. And of course, the most elusive indicator, limiting fear of crime, which is a topic of another discussion, but it's also central to policing activities and policing definition of legitimacy. So another element is that there is little political will to consolidate new ways to further understand the importance of democratic policing. Democratic policing being another difficult concept. We all talk about democratic policing, not in the Colombian Uribe way, but in general, in terms of what democratic policing really means. The Latin American police, as stated before, is really, multi-dimensional, but I think there are three characteristics that most define police institutions. One is corruption, second is abuse, violence, and third, inefficiency. 95% of all homicides in Mexico are not resolved, basically because there is lack of capacities to resolve them. And the numbers are not better everywhere in the region. Also, I would say that there is lack of transparency, limited use of data systems, high levels of political involvement, as Yanilda showed in the Colombian case, and an increasing militarization of the police and a policialization of the armed forces. And these two processes are very much present throughout Latin America. And I think that, those are, as Tom Taylor said before, in the US, the police and the armed forces are very separate. Even though, in Portland, we can discuss what happened there. Here in Latin America, because we don't have internal wars or wars against, each other, many people, citizens, politicians said, why don't we just use the police, the armed forces to police the cities? And that is also increasing the levels of violence. So for 20 years, I wrote a book on police reforms in Latin America 20 years ago. This is amazing. I just realized how old this book is. And unfortunately, many things hasn't changed. We are getting more sophisticated in the way we understand police reform. But in fact, I would say the most initiatives to reform the police in Latin America are scandal-based initiatives, either because of corruption or a killing or an efficiency or most police brutality. So after you have this huge media scandal, the political world decided to do something with the police, mostly general changes more than structural, as Yanilda explained in Colombian case. However, those multiple efforts are limited, are specific, are sporadic, and are external. And in the case of Argentina, for instance, there has been a lot of attempts to change a really corrupt police institution, but the idea is to, from the outside, change the whole institution, which is almost impossible. And that we need the police to be part of the reform. Otherwise, it's just, difficult to do. What are the results? And this is a generalization, of course. I will say that contra-reform efforts are really good, mostly linked to political policy. And also the buzzword in Latin America, community policing. I have a couple papers and that, and it's unfortunate that we call it community policy, but because in fact it's something really far from community policy. But you know, there is an increasing concern of data gathering, and I think that's good. And of course, our police institutions now are much better than 20 years ago, and are much better because they have higher infrastructure, they have higher salaries, they have better investment, and in general, we went from very poor police institutions with highly unskilled police officers to really strong, highly financed police institutions, but with the same, you know, abuse, inefficiency, and corrupt practices. So let me move to the Chilean case. In that awful, very pessimistic context, Chile was a different, you know, case. Everyone talk about the uniqueness of the Chilean case, but also the uniqueness of the Chilean police, Carabineros de Chile and National Police, which was brother to the National Police of Colombia. And I think this seminar is really interesting because we are discussing the best police or institutions in Latin America, you know, Colombia and Chile, those who are actually training other police officers in Latin America. Training, I mean, the whole process in Mexico, Guatemala, and Honduras is being led by Colombia and Chilean police officers, both militarized, both centralized, both autonomous institutions. So in the case of Chile, we have this national institution named Carabineros de Chile, so-called best police institution in Latin America. You know, they have huge levels of trust. 5, perhaps 8 years ago, trust in the police was higher than even the church before the pedophilia scandals. So it was really, you know, it was a strong institution, and that brought high levels of political and administrative autonomy. Of course, no government wanted to fight with the police because, you know, if you go to the street, to the community with a police officer, the community will open the doors for you. If not, you know, if you are against the police, the community will see you with some kind of disdain. So in that powerful situation, this militarized institution is in charge of crime control, crime prevention, and public order. Also, although it is not in charge of investigation, it's actually taking care of 50% of all cases. And that's because they just grew so strong. You know, they are so strong that they actually start getting some of the missions and functions of the investigative police, which is really small. Well, it's smaller than Carabineros. Levels of transparency are really limited. However, they have an important public relations strategy, and there is a couple of books by Michelle Bonner, a Canadian scholar, which actually reflects on these, you know, these communications and public relations strategy and how that actually fight against any initiative of police reforms, linked with a very personal relationship with the media. So media coverage, it always framed police work as a protective role. And that's very important because that brings also the sense of legitimacy or the sense of trustworthy institutions. However, you know, if taking the word of Augero that actually looks at Argentina, I think that we have an ambiguous police work with ambiguous police practices. It's abusive but protective. It's on the streets trying to help you, being a police, but also being a social worker. And that's a strategy that they used a lot. However, there is a long process, a historical process of violence against the youth, of violence in poor neighborhoods, and of course, violence against the Mapuches, the originary groups in the southern part of Chile. As Yanilda mentioned, you know, trust is really high, but a different indicator, approval, satisfaction with police work was also really high. And if you can see here, from 2015 to 2020, I mean, a couple of months ago, was still really high. These drops are all the drop in 2017, December 2017, August 2018, and lately in March 2020 are linked to scandals. And there is an important sense that the police recovers in the eye of the citizen. And that's something that has to do with this strategic policy substitution process, as Yanilda described in the case of Colombia too. Because now with COVID-19, the police regained their idea or their portray as protective of the citizen. And in that sense, perhaps that will, you know, limit the possibilities of the reform. So last year, as you probably know, we have this social upheaval named Estallido Social. The Estallido Social is a social protest and a lot of riots that started in October 2019. Social protection and economic policies were at the center of the agenda. However, the government once again used the police to control public order. And to control public order in this militarized, highly centralized, hierarchical institution is to use violence. I have to say that in Chile, protest, in order to protest, you have to request permission, as in some places in the US also. So if you are not, if you protest without permission, then you're illegal. And then the police can use the force against you to take you out of the public space. And most of the situations that we're facing are related to this illegal / criminalization of protest in Chile during the last year. What we saw is an increasing levels of police violence portrayed by media and social networks, violence that were not as uncommon, but now we're in the middle of the Santiago city, that were portrayed every day by the media, but most specifically by social networks, and lots of people, you know, claiming against police use of force. So after a month and a half, after thousands of people being gassed, being, you know, water, also being physically abused and sexually abused by the police, the fury targeted the police. So if you walk around Santiago last December, you will see that 90% of the graffitis were centered around police force and police abuses and police violence. At the end, police brutality. So in that context, for the first time since 1990, democratic election after 17 years of dictatorship, police reform became a concept that was basically mainstream in the government, which is a right-wing government, and also, you know, in the opposition, and in general, citizens were agree with the idea of a police and a structural police reform of Carabineros de Chile, because of course we have 6,000 human rights violation denounces that are being investigated now. We have around 400 people who that have eye injuries due to the lack of preparation, police will say, others will say due to the violent way they use some of their non-lethal weapons. So in that process, what I decided to do is, because there is no data on legitimacy or anything like that, we decided to do a survey in Chile, in La Región Metropolitana, in metropolitan region of Santiago, to try to figure out how the estallido social or social protest actually impacted the way people looked at carabineros. So what I will show you now are some of the results of my first survey. Now I'm doing the second wave, which it's interesting because this idea was to really understand legitimacy using Tankevi and Jackson and et al. Projects, but then we have the estallido social, and now we have COVID. So we have this survey, we call it like post-estallido, and our survey now will be like post-COVID survey. But that allows us also to figure out how much, the community is willing to accept the use of violence against the police. And we're working on a paper on that. So just really quickly, one of the things that we learned is that since our police institution is so broad in terms of their missions, we cannot talk in terms of general satisfaction with the police, because as you can see here, people think that they do some work to control transit, 51.6%, but on the bottom, people believe that the police doesn't actually do initiatives to fight arms on the streets or to fight drug trafficking or to control or prevent crime. So the core activities of the police, they are not as well regarded as the social protection, general, reception of working at the commissarias, or the public transit organization. And that's interesting because then you can also focus on public order or public management. You see that what type of, in the process of working on the streets, the people feel that the police abuse their force constantly. They think that they do not work under the protocol. They feel that they do not ensure human rights, that they are not really looking to enhance security for citizens. So if you look at these results, they are far from the 78% of trust in the general comparative chart that Yanilda showed. So there are a multiplicity of elements that have to be taken into account when we actually identify, legitimacy and trust on the police. Just specifically talking about the social upheaval, one of the, I would say, one of the most interesting results is that when we ask people how do they measure, evaluate, the role of institutions during these riots, these 3 months of huge riots that occur in Santiago, of course, firefighters were at the first, they got the best ranking. And then we have people on the street, protesters. And the third ones are what we call it la primera línea, which were portrayed by the media as basically the lumpen, the vandals, the criminals who were fighting against the police. So people really realized that those mostly youth that were exercising violence against the police were doing a good job. And that's quite interesting. That's an interesting result, and we should really talk about, more in terms of the use of force and the use of violence against police. We saw that in Hong Kong, we saw that in Portland, we saw that everywhere. People are moving ahead in terms of using the violence against the police, and not only using it, but also legitimizing it. Also, the institution is perceived as non-transparent and discriminatory. So in one of the questions we asked, do you think that they are open to show their spendings? Only 10% think that they are, actually showing what they spend the public money on. Or the statistics, 14%. Do you think that they treat all citizens equal? Only 17% think that. Of course, there is no known about their protocols or their disciplinary measures, and there is lack of complete transparency in their organizations. So only 20%, which is very different from the general question about the police, think that you can trust the police. And I think that, of course, this survey was done after the estallido, but I think that shows a different playbook to define legitimacy in Chile. So now, post-COVID, we were expecting a really difficult March 2020 because the estallido was supposed to continue. However, COVID-19 arrived and everyone got locked down in their houses. What we are expecting in Latin America and in Chile is more crime, more violence, increasing presence of organized crime, and increasing presence of social movements and even riots. That is a very difficult scenario to do police reforms. As Taylor said, in the US, you can talk about police reform because you have 3 decades of lowering the criminal rate. But here in Latin America, what we are going to expect to have, what we're expecting to have is more crime, more violence. So my sense is the police role would become even more important and key for democratic governments to ride these difficulties in the near future. Still, police reform and new ways to define police legitimacy should be taken into account. However, I think that the possibilities for a structural reform here in Chile, as well as in Colombia, are very limited. And perhaps we can concentrate more around specific problems rather than police culture or oversight or the main, strategic areas that the police reform should be focused on. So we are in a really bad moment to talk about police reforms due to the post-COVID situation. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much to our 3 panelists. This has been an amazing introduction for our conversation. So I think that we want to give space for people and to open also for the conversation of the 3 of you. So since we're a small group at Zoom, if someone has a question to our panelists, you can just raise your hand using the button that says raise your hand. And we will give you the possibility to open your microphone. And if people is shy right now, we also would like to take advantage of having the 3 of you right here and to open that conversation around what legitimacy, I think Lucia gave us a great opportunity to open the conversation about what legitimacy means in the US and what legitimacy looks like in Latin America with the cases of Colombia and Chile. So while people get excited to speak, I would like to, we have a question right here. Ariel, would you like to unmute yourself, please?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you so much for this space. And I would like, I'm not a police scholar nor criminology in general, but I'm Chilean, so I would like to ask Lucia in particular about police reform in the context of the constitutional debate we're having right now in Chile, and what that's going to look like, especially considering that that the political discussion, unlike maybe the US, sort of didn't start about the police. It started because of like general issues, like social issues, but then because of protests and police violence, like police became central in the debate. So yeah, I was wondering if you have any thoughts about the constitutional process we're about to have, and police reform, and how that might look, and if there's like some kind of experience from the Colombian case. I'm not aware of that, but yeah, thank you.
Yeah, Angela, should I just go ahead?
Yes,
Okay.
go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for the question. Well, Chile is one of the few countries that I'm aware of that the police organic law is in the constitution. So the organic law of the Carabineros was left by the dictatorship in the constitution. So if you want to change anything in the police, you have to have a really huge quorum to make a constitutional reform. And that's why nothing has been really changed in the last 30 years, but the movement from one Minister of Defense to the Minister of Interior. I'm pretty sure that that issue will be on debate. So there is an ample perception through the center to the left political realm that the organic law of the police should be out of the constitution. It should be a regular law that could be, defined with majority in the Congress. I just want to mention two very specific situations. The president of Chile cannot take out the director general of Carabineros. He has to have the accord of the Senate. If the Senate is against him, well, he cannot remove the chief of the police institution. And that's really weird. I haven't heard of that anywhere else. And that happened last year. And the president had to actually try to change that law. And that was an awakening for many people who actually didn't think that the police have to be into the constitutional debate. So yes, I think that it will play a role. It also will play a role, not only the institution, but also it will play a role the definition of public order and the whole definition of public security, because public security is also concentrated on property more than, I wouldn't call it human security, but at least some democratic security, or some, citizen security. So I think that those are the two or three areas in which the debate will be concentrated. Of course, as in Colombia, there is a huge debate on having a ministry of public security and moving the police over there, instead of having them on the Ministry of Interior. But I don't know if that will be actually being debated.
So Yanilda, you want to add something related to that for the Colombian case? We're not going through a constitutional process right now, but we're having that conversation around if we should formally separate military forces for police forces. So will you think that that will be something first politically feasible after what Lucia just told us about the context that we are? And two, if you think that that will make a difference, and that I would like to ask that also for Tom, if you will think that formally separating military forces and police forces can also help Latin America, and specifically the Colombian context, to move towards a direction of demilitarization of police forces?
Yeah, I mean, these are really important and central questions, just because of the among classical policing scholars, there has to be a clear separation between military roles and policing roles. But I want to ask us all to clarify what we all mean and what we have in mind when we think about formally separating those two things, because we see police militarization being one of the key items on the agenda of the United States, for example, even though they are formally and informally and every other way separated, and yet we see very specific clear forms of militarization happening here. So in Colombia, this has been a debate for decades, right? Ever since the 1950s, when the police forces that existed, right? There used to be, as Tom mentioned, there's only one national police, but there used to be many police forces in Colombia until the 50s, when they were all centralized in one national police force and put under the Ministry of War. And it was thought that militarization would shield the police from politics and the entrenched forms of violence, right? The period of la violencia that police were key participants in. So back then, militarization was seen as a shield from that kind of violence, right? And so today, though, we think about militarization very differently as a key contributor to police violence. And so in Colombia, the 1993 reform, and actually even before that reform, but like with the administration of Cesar Gaviria, there were very clear steps that were taken to separate police from military, right? Even the civilianization of defense policy and military policy, right? The installation of a civilian minister of defense for the first time under Gaviria in 1990. The definition of the police in the Colombian constitution as un cuerpo armado civil, right, is a civil, it's specifying that there's a civil body. I mean, various things that were done to take out operational control of the police by the military. So this has been an ongoing process in Colombia. And so it's really important to there's not one rupture that's going to happen. It's something that has moved forward and moved backwards at different periods in time. And so I just wanted to take a step back even to the earlier question about, right, moments of these moments of profound questioning of policing tend to coincide with profound questioning of broader institutional and political processes and societal processes. And I don't think there are that many examples where that's not the case, right? In the US, people are not just, Black Lives Matter does not only talk about policing. Right, there's fundamental questions about racial justice and historical, structural, institutional processes that are being questioned, and it was the same in Colombia in the early 90s, and even from the mobilizations that were happening last year. Right, there was a questioning of the broader political process, of its representativeness, of inequality, and now has morphed into policing. But I at least am one that sees these processes as all being linked together, because police are central institutions in society and in political systems. And so it's difficult, in my view, to separate those two things. But just to answer your question, I mean, I think with respect to back to the military, like, it's just a question of the last several decades of the military being willing to give up power over the police as well, not only the extent to which politicians feel the pressure to demilitarize as such. It's something that the military has also resisted a great deal in Colombia. So that's an additional obstacle. But I'll stop there and have Tom chime in.
Okay. Well, I first want to echo what Yanilda said, in that I think we have to understand that the crisis we're seeing in America may look like a crisis in policing, but it's also a crisis on a lot of deeper levels. One of the things that has happened in the United States, and it's gotten now quite a long time this has happened because it started when Nixon was president, is basically systematic withdrawal of government support from inner city communities. And as that support has disappeared, social services have suffered. At the same time, the police have always been available through a 911 call, so increasingly the police have been the people who show up for all kinds of problems intensifying their inability to manage problems that don't involve basically the use of force. So the police are very prominent in everyone's attention because they're there so often for so many reasons and so bad at it. But I think we want to recognize that this is really an underlying crisis in a failure of our federal government to support urban development, to support community well-being. And, you know, we're seeing a lot of problems at the municipal city level for those reasons. People don't have the money for social services, and the police often are the best organized group in the community. So they are called to do these things. But on the question of militarization, we're very fortunate in the United States that we have this history of separation of the military and the police. That we struggle constantly, and we've certainly struggled in the last decade to reinforce and maintain that. One of the things that has happened in the wake of the 9/11 attack on the United States is that the police, who recognize that their role is threatened because crime is so low right now, have adopted this mission of terror prevention so that the local authorities preventing terror attacks all over America are the local police, which has made them the recipients of all kinds of military equipment and has militarized police forces all over the place. And so you see small town police forces with Army armored cars for whatever, who knows, in the terror attack in Missoula, Montana or something, they have an armored car. And this has been something that has been a mission for the police and buys into the warrior spirit that we think is such a problem in our police culture. But it's very bad for separating clearly between the military and the police. And so I think we have this tradition. It's a very important tradition. We have to fight in America and the United States. We have to fight to try to keep that. So we're struggling, I think right now, very hard with maintaining an advantage that we have had. And I think in reverse, in those countries where there's a closer separation, you know, if you could make them more distinct, it would be really valuable.
If someone else has a question, will you mind to raise your hand and we will give you the word? Okay, it seems that we have a shy public. Norberto, do you know we have questions on the Facebook Live right now?
No, in Facebook we don't have questions, but I have a question for all our guests. First of all, thank you very much for your excellent presentations. We think that that kind of conversations can give some solutions for all the situation that we are seeing in our countries. I have a question especially related to the role of the judges. It's because in Colombia, we had the last month a judicial decision which ordered some protocols to prevent abuse by the police. And that decision was severely criticized. And my question is, in your opinion, may judges assume this type of decisions, or may the judges give that kind of orders or end up invading legislative competence? Is the hard debate that we have here if the judges can adopt that kind of orders? In the order that you want. The question is for all our guests.
Yanilda, you want to start?
I wasn't clear on what kind of order the judges.
You're referring to the latest decision that there is systematic violence, right?
Yeah. Yes. So we have our Supreme Court. There was a tutela action for the people that is not from Colombia. It's a particular law tool that we have to protect human rights or fundamental rights. So because the government has been sending this MAD, that is the special force that Yanilda described. It's a particular type of police to control protest, and we have excess of violence in those protests. What the Supreme Court said, and like it just like basically reiterated what is already in the Constitution, is that in Colombia we do have the right to protest, so the government cannot limit that right or use the threat of violence to delegitimize the protest, or just basically create negative incentives to people to go out to protest. So basically the decision right now, or the debate, is whether the Supreme Court basically was taking the role of the Congress by basically ordering, or the executive power ordering police forces and military forces to behave in a certain way, or whether the Supreme Court was just trying to enforce what the Constitution says at the end, because of the polarization of half of the people believing and trusting police forces and half of the people distrusting police forces. There's not like a public unifying opinion. So we want to hear, what do you think about when the judicial power enters and tries to mediate?
Got it. Thank you so much, Angela, for that the explanation. I'm out of date, out of touch, clearly out of date with the latest with respect to the protest and that court decision. But I think generally, right, I mean, I think this is a fundamental question of democracy, of the role of executive branch, legislative branch, and judicial branch in regulating all aspects of social and political life. And so policing should be no different. But when it, as I was alluding to earlier, the courts have been very hesitant to hold police officers accountable in acts of police violence. And that's not something that's limited to Colombia. It's something that it's seen, it's almost non-existent in the case of Sao Paulo in Brazil, and it's almost also non-existent in the case of the United States. And so in this instance, I think it's really meaningful to see a court step in and say that the way that police behave systematically with respect to the right to protest violates a constitutional principle. And so I think that, you know, I'm not a constitutional scholar, and so with respect to, you know, sort of, is this constitutional in the Colombian case, is not something that I am equipped to weigh in on. From the perspective of somebody, a political scientist focused on policing and democracy, it's a role that that courts should be playing in constraining police abuses, and in particular with respect to a fundamental right, which is the right, freedom of expression, and the right to protest. The exact line of where that should lie, I leave that to constitutional scholars. But I think that it is a fundamental question for democracy if these civilian institutions are going to play a role in constraining police action. As I sort of showed in my presentation, more often than not, what we've seen is whether it's legal, judicial institutions, political institutions, or executive branch institutions that are in fact charged with police oversight, they have all been very hesitant historically to actually undertake that role. And so I think that we have to at least acknowledge that this is a significant moment, and that it is an appropriate role for courts to play to constrain police action and with respect to citizens and citizens' rights. But the specific legal question on this particular case, I leave that to the constitutional lawyers.
You know, I would echo that comment that we've had enormous trouble in the United States holding the police to legal account for their actions. It's partly judges being very reluctant, including all the way up to our Supreme Court, very reluctant to create rules that are effective, relying on rules that, like qualified immunity, that we have widespread evidence are damaging. And on the local level, we have a problem that's very American, which is all of our police and court systems related to these issues are local. And so they're very much intertwined with local political authorities. And so prosecutors are elected, and even in some places judges are elected. And whether they're elected or not, they all work together, so they don't want to offend each other. And it's been a source of great frustration that both locally and on the national level, we've had a lot of trouble getting effective legal regulation of the police. So again, I know even less about the situation in Colombia than the other panelists, but I would say as a general principle, if the judicial system is trying to hold the police to account, that I think that's fantastic.
Yeah, I just want to mention that I think that the Supreme Court document is not related to the latest protest. It's a long process of research on other cases, and I think it's really important that they show that there is profiling, and there is discriminatory measures taken by the police, that the police are using the force against some specific groups of the society. I'm in favor of them opening the door for further discussion on police reform. And timing was interesting, though. We can discuss whether the Supreme Court decided just to launch this report in the midst of all these protests a couple of weeks ago. But in fact, I think I read some of it, and I think it's a really important, issue to discuss. And they allow us to at least start debating, for instance, the military justice system in Colombia as well in Chile, for instance.
Carlos de la Rosa told me he has a question. Carlos, do you want to unmute yourself?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you all for your interesting presentations. This question is directed to all and any of you. So looking at the experiences and issues regarding police performance in a federal system, the USA, and two unitary systems or centralized governments as Chile and Colombia, I wonder whether you think a federal model or a centralized model is better suited to promote or to facilitate police reform. Like, what are some of the advantages or disadvantages you see in each model concerning the possibility of achieving comprehensive police reform? That would be it. Thank you very much.
Well, I can start by saying, Carlos, thank you. I'll start by saying that police reform is a political reform. So, and if you have many political stakeholders, police reform is more difficult to implement. And that's what's happening, at least in Latin America. If you look at Brazil, Venezuela, well, Venezuela is a different case, but Brazil, Mexico, Argentina, you have different police, political brokerage over there, and that helps and hinders police reform. So I'm not sure if the unitary or the federal opens the door for a structural police reform, because since it is political, then if you go to the national level, of course, politicians are not really into getting into this huge structural change that it's linked to police reform. They just want to make some specific changes, and that's it. Because, and this is the elephant in the room, they're very much afraid of the police not doing their work. They're very much afraid of homicides going up, or some other type of, police extortion that will hinder or, their political power. So nowadays, I don't think that either federal or unitary type of governments are better off. I think that the political context in Latin America is just difficult for this such a structural reform to move forward.
And I would agree with the idea that it may not be that there's one right answer to your question. In the United States, we have a form of government that was basically designed in opposition to a king, where a lot of authority was pushed down to the local level. And as I said earlier, we have 18,000 police departments and similar mess of court systems and jails and so on. And I think the best thing you can say about that is that in over 200 years, there hasn't been a coup and America hasn't been overthrown by an autocratic leader. We're all holding our breath right now to make sure we make it to 300 years. But that's an advantage of local control. You're basically pushing power all over the place so nobody has an enormous amount of authority. And, you know, that's the benefit of local control. But as a person also who's trying to reform police departments, you know, I could get my suitcase together and go from department to 18,000 departments and make my speeches. And that's really hard. They are all under local control. They're all locally politically connected. So that's the downside of local control. I think it depends an awful lot on what the federal government is like, what it's doing. When the federal government in the United States was pushing civil rights, we all thought it was great. Now when it's pushing army troops into Portland, we think it's terrible. So it's kind of, I don't think you can say one way is better. I think it depends a lot on the nature of the political process in a country.
Yeah, I would also echo that. I mean, I think, you know, it may sound like a cop-out, an easy way out to say it depends. But I do think that it does, because there's not one type of federal system, and there's not one type of unitary system. And so, for example, in Brazil, there's a constitutional provision that separates the police forces into military police forces and civil police forces, and makes the military police forces an auxiliary force to the armed forces. And yet the police forces themselves are controlled at the state level. And so you have one of the most fundamental aspects of the police forces in Brazil that is at the core of many problems that lead to a great deal of the high rates of police violence that we see in Brazil, that the political level that actually controls the police cannot actually change. Right, so even though there's lots of people say that federal systems allow for experimentation and you know, perhaps political mobilization that happens at a smaller level, such as at the state level rather than at the national level. In this case, the setup of the federal system is one that really blocks one of the most significant changes that would need to take place from being done at that political level. And at the same time, we've seen other examples of federalism where the U.S. government, if it wanted to, you know, could push for a lot of reforms at the local level, right? Through consent decrees, through sort of all these different instruments that it does have, and more often than not chooses not to use. And at the same time, we have unitary systems where if the president is the one that ultimately controls the police force, it centralizes both the possibility of great change, but also may block off who wants to give up power over the police, right? And so it's something that that again, it depends on what kind of federal structure we're talking about, and what kind of unitary structure as well. So just to give you a sense of some of that complexity, but I would sort of underscore the political process in it. That reform is possible under both systems, and it is deeply difficult under both systems, all responding to these sort of different political configurations and moments. So, but it's a great question that you've asked, Carlos. Thank you.
Thank you very much, all of you.
So Norberto told me we have 3 questions on Facebook for our panelists.
Yeah, the first one is from Patrick Johnson. Patrick asks, are there any studies at the scale that measure the 4 pillars of procedural justice: voice, respect, neutrality, trustworthiness, as reported by community members of a specific jurisdiction? Is the first one. And the other is related, is from Angie Amado, is related to fake news and the situation in Colombia of SMAT. And she wants to know what is the role of the communication media in the manifestations.
Well, we have two different ways that we have measured the 4 elements of procedural justice, primarily in America. We've done many studies of the population and their judgments about the elements that they see in the police actions in different communities. And also within police departments, we have looked at whether officers feel that the dynamics of different departments are fair. And that kind of information, I mean, I'd be happy to give that kind of information to whoever should get it, and we can get it to people that would be interested. I think that there's an increasing excitement about these ideas in Latin America, and the Mexico City work that I mentioned that Rodrigo Canales is doing at Yale is fantastic. And I recommend he has scales for measuring all these things that are in Spanish that have been used in Mexico.
Yeah, just echoing what you're saying, there is a very interesting paper by Jose Miguel Cruz from El Salvador. There is a couple of people working on legitimacy issues in Brazil. There are papers being published, I think, last year and this year, either on exactly the 4 pillars. We are also working on that here in Chile. The main problem that we face is that it's very difficult to work with the police to figure out, you know, how they describe procedural justice. But we are focusing mostly on the perception side, which is a good first step towards moving the debate from detainees and drug seizures and all those police outputs into fair treatment, you know, trustworthiness and stuff like that.
Okay, so I think we only have one question to close because we're getting right there with time and we don't want to keep you any longer. We know the time differences. It's really late in Santiago right now. So I think that to close is, I think the 3 of you have talked about this tension about the demand of social services from police forces, but at the same time, this security or crime tension that I think is actually the key part about militarization indirectly, right? We have been into the business of more proactive policing, which moves more similar to what military forces do in ways like in the war on drugs or in the war against terrorism. So with everything that is happening right now with the COVID situation, with elections, with this fear of crime, of terror, of drugs, that we're living to also like criminalization of immigration. How do you think, I mean, I think Lucia already gave us an opening about that, but I want to like to close with that idea of what are the difficulties of the challenges to get, to overcome this tension or ambiguity of the society demanding more forces, but at the same time, society is demanding a fairness procedure, and this tension between how do we understand legitimacy and how we sometimes understand legitimacy in terms of efficiency. It seems that we're asking for both things, and that's the disconnection. So I will give you the word on that, and then we will close our panel.
Well, so I want to agree with what Lucia said earlier, which is that it's hard, for all the reasons, Angela, that you said, it's hard to push for change when people are really frightened and when they think there's an immediate threat and danger to their security. That's why in the United States, this has been a really opportunity. This is a moment because crime has been so low and has stayed low. And that is a real chance for us to talk about long-term solutions, better solutions. The trouble with force may be necessary in an emergency, but force doesn't build trust. And so, you know, you ultimately come back to the same problem over and over again, which is a lack of trust. Either you've not built it or you've even destroyed it through the things you do for security. That's the central inherent tension that I think we're all seeing. And that's why I at least hope at this moment in the United States that we might be able to get some traction and make some progress. Although again, I would acknowledge that we don't want just cosmetic progress. We want real structural change. And there are always forces against that because people are protecting their jobs, their careers. The police, you know, they have to be moved to change, and that can be a political issue.
Yeah. Well, this is this has been a very interesting conversation. I think that, of course, in Latin America, there is corruption, there is a high penetration of organized crime into our police institutions. There is lack of transparency, and of course, there is the political interest on having the police in their side. So those are the elements, along with the COVID-19 post-pandemic, hopefully, a scenario that will limit police reforms. But we will continue with this ambiguous institution that on the one hand tells you that there is a community policing initiative and they will work with you and they are preventive, and on the other hand they're just shooting at you or really using violence or disappearing people and torturing people almost everywhere in Latin America. So my sense is that we are going to face a process in which some people will actually disengage from obeying the law. As Tom said in their model, people who think that police are non-legitimate, then they do not obey the law. So we are having very frightening, pictures of our future, either paramilitaristic initiatives or, highly private security organizations. But in any case, the lack of police reform will haunt us for a long time. The problem is that this is not the moment to do it, unfortunately.
I'm not going to fully disagree with Tom and Lucia because they're much smarter than I am, and they've been at this a lot longer. But I would just say that sort of high levels of violence, I mean, even strong organized crime are not sort of impossible. Don't make police reform impossible. And the Colombian case is one that I always turn to sort of demonstrate that. Because if you look at the reform that happened in 1993, which as I mentioned, really sought to shake up every aspect of policing, that happened in the context of sort of having some of the highest homicide rates in the world. And of course, very, very powerful drug cartels. And of course, an internal armed conflict with very, very powerful, at the time, sort of armed guerrilla groups. So, it was not that process that doomed the police reform. There was political processes of societal mobilization and political competition. My argument is that there was sort of societal mobilization and political competition, which enabled a kind of societal and political consensus that favored reform to happen in 1993. And then things shifted. Subsequently, those political and societal conditions shifted back to their previous levels, and that is what allowed the police to undo those reforms. So I don't know that it is sort of an unsurmountable obstacle to reform when the political and social conditions allow it. Sort of on their own, those are not. I have not found them to be the determining obstacle. At least if we look to the Colombian case as an example.
Yeah, you're right. I think a political will is more important than anything.
Okay, so it's 6:04 in Central Time. So to let you go to have some rest, I'm going to thank you again, our three panelists, Professor Tom Tyler, Professor Yanilda Gonzalez, and Professor Lucia Dammert. I want to also thank again Universidad Javeriana for facilitating this, and the Yale Macmillan Center Council of Latin American and Iberian Studies for funding the translation and allowing to have this bilingual conversation. We hope this is just the opening of more transnational conversations and bilingual conversations. So thank you very much to everyone, to the panelists. Have a good night. I'm going to stop the meeting right now. So have a good night. Thank you so much.
Thank
you.
Angela.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Tom.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Norberto. Thanks, everyone.